fellow youth who were on the mission trip last year, to see your friends in the pews. Irreplaceable time to build fellowship. But that's not the primary reason why Jesus died on the cross, is it? The church is learning that it's not just a museum of great stained glass windows, of organ, a repository of sacred music from 200 years ago, the place where grandmother and grandfather were married, the place where my children were baptized, the place where I grew up in Sunday school. Those are sacred, but the church is not primarily a museum of the sacred. That's not why Jesus called us together. The church is not primarily a civic organization. It used to be almost that the production of good citizens was the church's goal. I mean, they were one and the same. A good church member, a good citizen, we were all kind of the same. That's not enough anymore. The church is not primarily a political action committee, although it's crucial that the church and its members be involved in justice, advocacy, in reaching out and changing laws, changing the world for the better. But that's not the primary reason we get together. The church is the body of Christ. The church was called into being by Jesus Christ himself. It's a human institution created in response to God's invitation. Kirk Hathaway writes that the purpose of the church is to prepare disciples of Jesus Christ for the sake of the world. Jesus gave us two invitations when he called the church into being. He gave us two commandments. The first commandment is to love God and neighbor. The second commandment is to go out and make disciples, to share this love with the rest of the world. And that's the only reason, those two things. That's the reason why the church exists. However we do that in whatever local setting, that's what we are called to be. And congregations that are figuring that out, I'm excited to say, are the ones that are finding life and vitality today. So what are we going to look like as we emerge from this wilderness of wandering? What's the reborn church going to look like? Nobody really knows for sure. I'm not even sure God knows, because God builds this new thing in partnership with us, and nobody knows how we will respond going into the future. But I'll give you some clues. It will be marked by mission as opposed to maintenance. We are not called to maintain an institution, we are called to go out in mission. Second thing, it will be more of a frontier mentality, not a fortress mentality. Most of our church buildings, if you've ever looked at church buildings, they are built to look like medieval castles. Have you ever noticed that? They look like a defensive kind of thing to keep the riffraff out and to keep something holy in. But Paul Nixon writes, we need to get away from that mentality, that we have something special here inside, and see the front doors of each local congregation as the beginning of the mission field, to see that as the frontier. The parking lot is the beginning of the frontier for each of us now as we move forward. The church of the future is going to be a church intentional in mission and ministry. I want to close with a parable, but it's going to be one of those Paul Harvey kind of parables. You know Paul Harvey? Do you remember Paul Harvey? Paul Harvey used to tell you a story, and then he'd say, now for the rest of the story. So we'll get to that in a minute. The story begins with a parable called the life-saving station. Has anybody heard it? It's been around. It's been around since a year before I was born, in fact. It goes like this. There was a life-saving station on the coast. The coastline of a very rugged coast where ships were breaking up in the rocks and in the waves. So a group of people got together to build a life-saving station. When a ship would wreck, they'd go out in their little boats and they'd save the survivors. They'd bring them back to the life-saving station. Over the years, they continued doing this. The life-saving station grew and grew. And eventually people, as they wanted to spruce it up a little bit. You know, it was a little tiny shack, and they just had these old boats, so they built a nicer building around themselves, and they got newer boats. So that it was a building they could be proud of. They put stained glass windows in it, and they probably put an organ in it. You know, a life-saving station with a great organ. They kept saving lives, but eventually the folks kind of got tired of doing that work. In fact, one day they went out, and there was a big shipwreck, and they brought all these bedraggled, wet, dirty people in, and it got their new carpeting all dirty, and they weren't sure they wanted to trust these survivors with the sacred things in their life-saving station. Basically, the station became more of a club where they liked being together. They still called it a life-saving station, but it began to function more like a club. And it turned out that fewer and fewer of them were going out on the life-saving mission, and more of them were just living as club members. This parable has been around, and it's an indictment against every congregation. Every congregation needs to take it seriously. But now for the rest of the story. This was written by Reverend Dr. Theodore Waddell. He was the rector of the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., an Episcopal cathedral. He wrote it in 1953. And it's been part of the sort of the cultural legacy since then. Well, in 2010, the National Cathedral, where he had been the rector, was on hard financial times. This was the height of the economic depression. The National Cathedral was a depository of rare books. They had a collection, a library of rare books worth $6 million. And they were known worldwide for this rare book collection. All of a sudden, the church couldn't afford to be a church and to maintain its rare book collection. So what do you think this church, the legacy of Dr. Theodore Waddell, did? They up and decided that their mission was not to be a rare book library, but to be a church, to save those who were struggling, to create disciples for the sake of the world, disciples of Jesus Christ, not to house rare books. So they up and sold their collection of rare books. And I'm thinking to myself, if the bastion of mainline Protestantism, such as the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C., can radically shift its mission and ministry to go back to a first century ideal of ministry, then maybe there's hope for the rest of us also. Let's be a prayer for a minute. Holy God, we thank you. We thank you even for the challenges of today. We sometimes sense that we are wandering in a wilderness. Help us to appreciate this time as a rare gift, a time of perhaps uncertainty, but also a time of deep reflection, a time of discernment, a time where we may sense where your Spirit is leading in ways that we couldn't before. Help us to make wise decisions, and help us to be part of that Spirit, part of your ministry in the days, the weeks, the decades